He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowing reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. They made him blow a bugle for his Uncle Sam. It really brought him down because they could rap. He's in the...
By spring 1945, American soldiers in Europe knew for sure the bloodiest war in human history was coming to an end. A song kept singing in English.
He puts the boys to sleep with boogie every night and wakes them up the same way in the early bright. They clap their hands and stamp their feet because they know how he plays when someone gives him.
On April 12, 1945, sitting in the living room of his warm spring cottage, then known as the Little White House, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was working with papers. The American artist of Russian origin Elizabeth Shumatov was painting his portrait. She was trying not to bother him and only occasionally would ask him to lift his eyes. All of a sudden, the silence was broken by the sound of a fallen pen. Elizabeth was terrified when she saw that Roosevelt closed his eyes and dropped his head on the desk. The future president began his career in 1910, when a young 27-year-old lawyer named Franklin Delano Roosevelt became a senator in New York. 2 years later, the U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, appointed the young and active politician from a wealthy and influential family to be Assistant U.S. Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt did not turn the president's hopes down and proved to be a gifted leader. 8 years in this position turned Franklin into quite a noticeable figure in Washington, D.C., and in 1920 he was recommended to run for the U.S. Vice President from the Democratic Party. During his election campaign, Roosevelt delivered over 1,000 speeches and visited 32 states. His energy and eloquence and his personal charm won millions of votes. By the end of the campaign, Roosevelt even upstaged the candidate for presidency for his own party. But Republicans defeated them, and Democrats and Roosevelt lost. However, in spite of the loss of Democrats, the papers wrote that a new bright star was rising on the political horizon of America: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Many felt jealous. It looked like this dandy had success in everything he undertook. He was a successful lawyer, a political celebrity, and a father of a big family. But a disaster happened that cardinally changed his life. In August 1921, during his vacation on the Campobello Island in Canada, he suddenly fell sick. Poliomyelitis, a dangerous viral disease. In its severe form, it might lead to disability and, at times, even death. Roosevelt had bad luck. A blooming, good-shaped, 38-year-old handsome man became a paralytic. First, he couldn't even move his fingers. Later, the sensibility of the muscles in his hands, abdomen, and back started gradually coming back, but the legs were still completely paralyzed. The sentence of the doctors was harsh. Franklin Roosevelt would never walk. He refused to believe that and tried many new methods of treatment. Gymnastics and sunbaths, electrotherapy and massage. But nothing helped. Franklin could not get used to his new situation. He rejected the condolences and tried to hide the fits of deep despair from his family. You can forget about the career of a politician and other joys of the past life. He was thrown overboard by the relentless fate. Roosevelt was rethinking and reevaluating all his life. He was thinking about his childhood, student years, his success as a lawyer. He had been gifted with an exceptional memory and imperishable self-confidence since his young years. His childhood was cloudless. Franklin was born to a wealthy family, and he could afford never thinking about money or a job. The Roosevelt family estate was his universe, and he was a little prince in it. Mountains and valleys, forests and fields, the pond and the ocean nearby, all belonged to him. Franklin loved the manor, especially in winter when everything around him looked like a fairy tale. He could spend hours sledging down the Hyde Park hills. The child years passed by like a sledge down the hill, and adult life began. First of all, Franklin entered into Harvard University, a nursery for American elite. And then he chose for himself his distant relative, Theodore Roosevelt, as an idol.
Theodore Roosevelt was a man who thought that life was worth living only when it was tense and exciting. He was an incredible person. He was a man who traveled down the Amazon River, who killed 500 lions, who went through everything.
In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the President of the United States. To look more like his uncle, Franklin began to smoke, wear nose glasses, and use his typical words. And he even fell in love with Theodore's niece, Eleanor, who he married in 1905. They had 6 children in the next 10 years. But it was Eleanor who took care of rearing the children, since the young, successful lawyer Roosevelt spent almost all of his time traveling. A rapid rise followed. A 27-year-old senator, 33-year-old assistant secretary of the Navy, and a 39-year-old candidate for vice presidency. And here came the end. The illness and disability. For 3 long years, Roosevelt was fighting to get back to his habitual life. It seemed like his universe was contracting to the size of a bedroom. But in summer 1923, the spring was released. Roosevelt decided to live as if nothing had happened. He bought a boat, left his mother, wife, and children, and took off for a several-month-long trip down south with his friends.
His life before 39 and after 39 were 2 different lives. Before the disaster, he lacked some personal depth. He lacked what is called compassion, understanding the drama of life. He became deeper. He became more interesting being a cripple. His disability developed his intellectual ability, made him a more skillful politician and a better thinker. He got rid of the superficiality of the previous years. His externalism faded away. Even if it sounds terrible, his being in a wheelchair was for his own good.
While traveling, Roosevelt found out about Warm Spring, a small town in Georgia known for its healing mineral springs. After bathing there, he could move his toes for the first time in many years. So again, he had this hope for full recovery. And he spent 2/3 of his capital to buy this abandoned resort. He reconstructed it completely and soon reopened it for healing the people with poliomyelitis consequences. First, he takes care of the children himself, and then the flow of patients increased. Roosevelt brought there the most authoritative doctors and experts. The resort turned out to be a good business as well and started to bring in good income. It seemed that the further life of Dr. Roosevelt, as the kids called him, was predetermined. But in 1928, Roosevelt ran as a candidate for New York governor. Franklin Roosevelt recovered. This is how the papers commented on the situation. But in reality, the recovery meant only that he could stand for a short while on a stick and make a few awkward steps. And that was possible due to prostheses' invisible underpants.
Многие историки пишут, что был даже некий сговор, направленный...
Many historians wrote that there was even a conspiracy aimed to conceal from Americans Roosevelt's disability. In reality, it was a well-known fact that Roosevelt had problems with his health. At least in 1928, his health was the Achilles heel of his election campaign for the position of governor of New York. To prove that he was healthy enough, he made a tour around the whole state, and at the end of every speech, he would always ask, "So what? Do I look like a sick person?" Surely the crowd excited by his speech would shout no.
Естественно, кричала «нет».
Due to swimming and continuous training, Roosevelt had a very well-developed upper part of his body, and the people from his team would nail down every pulpit where he delivered his speeches. If you watch the archive video, you will see how strongly he gripped the pulpits while speaking. But in spite of all of this, his speeches were lively, exciting, and very expressive. He wished America saw him as a strong man of action, and he reached this goal.
И у него это получилось.
But still, his serious disability made his everyday life a torture, and participation in political events was even harder. For the rest of his life, he would have to literally think over each step. How to get out of the car so that not too many people could see it. How to get to the pulpit to give a speech. Where to stand. What to lean on, whose arm to rest on when giving public speeches. But despite everything, Roosevelt won. The crippled man became the governor of the most important state of America and stayed there for 2 terms. On the very first days in Albany, the state capital, Roosevelt became very active. A New York journalist wrote, "Our new governor's activity reminds one of mad races." In the first year of his career, Roosevelt upended the whole state administration. He was decisive in firing officers, sunk in corruption and intrigue. He began construction of new schools and hospitals. He created a social security system, one of the first ones in America, to help the poor and unemployed. Roosevelt believed that the government is supposed to work not only for the rich, but for the poor as well, and primarily for the middle class.
Roaring 20s, we call it.
The 1920s, or as they were called in America, Roaring Twenties, are a very interesting period of the United States development. But the first impressions from the 20s are mostly deceptive. Yes, for sure, America had an economic boom that consisted of fantastic economic growth. However, this distribution of benefits and wealth was absolutely unfair, improper, and wild. A thin layer of wealthy people had everything, but the government was doing absolutely nothing to create a middle class that supports the whole society and economy. It was all going to a breakdown.
And it came pretty soon. The New York stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, and was the beginning of a new and most dramatical period in the U.S. history.
The American economy that had been growing incredibly fast over 10 years collapsed. Every liner going out of the port meant minus $1 billion. Money was being taken out of the country. The country was on the edge of a disaster, social, economic, moral, and spiritual, in every respect. Mostly the crisis was entailed by the problems in the financial field that needed the government interference. Many soap bubbles were appearing. Financial pyramids were developing. Unsecured shares were being sold. And as a result, the financial market crashed.
It was fatal for the whole U.S. economy. Thousands of factories, businesses, and even public institutions were closed. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs and became beggars. The situation of those who still had a job was not much better. Salaries were not paid for months, even to public officers. In order to survive and feed their families, many scientists and intellectuals became street traders. In the depth of the country, the situation was disastrous. Chaos, starvation, and ruin. Leaving their homes and households behind, whole families would move to larger cities. Shortly after, numerous settlements made of cardboards and tin pieces grew in the large city's outskirts. The whole world was so shocked by the horror of what was going on in America that some funds were raised in Africa and sent to the United States to distribute among starving children. The strong and cheerful American nation, certain of their superiority, turned into a gloomy gray mass that lost their faith in everything. In America, the future, themselves, and their government. And President Hoover still believed that the government should not interfere in the free economy and that the people themselves were to solve their economic problems. The New York governor Franklin Roosevelt did not think this way. He was convinced that supporting the poor is the government's direct and integral duty. He managed to get $20 million from the Senate to provide urgent aid to the starving and unemployed. In the meanwhile, the crisis in the country reached its peak and was called the Great Depression. When journalists asked President Hoover what advice he could give Americans in this situation, he replied, "Smile and laugh more." But just in case, he commanded the army to be up in arms to suppress the national insurrection that, as he believed, was soon to happen. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was nominated a candidate for the U.S. presidency from the Democratic Party.
Traveled around the country.
While running for presidency, Roosevelt traveled through the whole country. He delivered hundreds of speeches. He promised to Americans the new course and changes that would lead to the rehabilitation of the capitalist system. He never made it clear in what ways he was going to save the country. He didn't know himself. Those times, Roosevelt's advisors were giving him lots of ideas on how to get the economy and society out of the bog, how to help the farmers and impoverished Americans, and how to eliminate unemployment, how to help industry out. Roosevelt did not know what options he would choose, but he clearly saw the main goal, the country's revival.
During short breaks between his travels around the country, Roosevelt would visit the Hyde Park. The best place to work was the houses where he spent his childhood. Traveling around the familiar places of his estate together with his son, Roosevelt was thinking about big politics and building his platform.
What do Americans want most of all? Jobs and security guarantees for themselves and their families, Nobody shall be hungry, and with no clothes, without a place to live. It is the duty of the state, of the government, to take care of the people. The country needs a bold and continuous experiment. But common sense requires choosing a way and following it. If the way is wrong, you need to honestly admit it and find another way. The main thing for the moment is to save the country. And if with this goal in mind we have to change our views twice a day, we will do it too.
In the meanwhile, the situation in the country was getting worse and worse. Everything that is going on in America today is just a repression of what happened in Russia before the revolution, wrote the left-wing papers. The capitalist system was dead, and everybody knew it. And all the roads led to communism. The Soviet people had achieved many things, and they were happy then. Everybody had the right for a job and for rest in the USSR. Roosevelt tried to explain to Americans that in order to save America, communist or fascist recipes were not good. American capitalism had to lower its appetites and agree that the government had to interfere. New jobs needed to be created, loans had to be given to the poor, and funds needed to be assigned for federal Social Security programs. The country was listening to this candidate for presidency with great attention. On the night of November 8, 1932, it was known that Roosevelt won the presidency. America did believe in the new course. On the inauguration day, 100,000 people gathered in front of the Capitol. There were secret spots with machine guns and armed patrols just in case. The city authorities feared mass disorders. And the crowd was waiting for the first words of the new president.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. This nation asks for action, and action now. We must act, and act quickly. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency. As great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. The people of the United States want direct, vigorous action. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes.
The United States had been waiting for a miracle. And he had to be this miracle maker. The 32nd President of the USA, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the meanwhile, the country entered the next loop of the economic depression. The banking crisis.
Roosevelt came to power when the economic crisis was in full play. The big problem that Roosevelt had to solve literally on the second day after his inauguration was the crash of the banking financial system, without which the economy could not function at all. Banks began to close down, and the depositors rushed to take their deposits.
The few unclosed banks were taken by storm. 11,000 banks around the country had already been closed, and the new U.S. president issued his first decree. He closed the other banks in the country. He had to stop the money flow out. But Roosevelt understood that he had to clearly explain all of his actions to Americans. Otherwise, he would not gain their support, and all of his good undertakings would just crash. So Roosevelt addressed the country on the radio. His first radio conversation was on the banking crisis. All the banks were closed down by his decree several days ago.
I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, and why it has been done, and what the next steps are going to be. Roosevelt believed that he had to talk to his people, and he would talk to his friends. And then Roosevelt, literally in hand-waving terms, explained what the essence of the banking crisis was. He said it in such a manner that everyone believed. They believed in the seriousness of the government's intentions. They believed that government would protect their interest.
Last time, you people must have faith.
You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. Together we cannot fail. I assure you, my friends, it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
And a miracle happened again. Americans believed the words of their new president, and the next day they started to bring their money to the reopened banks. However, only those banks were reopened that were recognized healthy by governmental inspection. More than 4,000 banks of the United States ceased to exist forever. Now, Roosevelt's radio addresses to the nation, the so-called fireside chats, were heard regularly by Americans. In his next fireside chat, Roosevelt would tell the country about the government's plans to overcome the crisis.
Well, we must take action to
It is time to act, and act with courage.
Пришло время для мужественных действий.
We cannot achieve prosperity if a part of the nation will prosper and the other will suffer.
Если часть нации будет процветать, а другая бедствовать.
The unemployment rate.
The unemployment rate was up to 50% in some American cities. Roosevelt was right when he believed that unregulated capitalism was the rough and unjust system of all. But regulated capitalism did work. Capitalism regulation was the essence of this new course. The new course had three major goals. First of all, it was to help the starving and unemployed. Second, recovery. These programs served the goal of setting American economy back on its feet. Third, reforms. It was a package of decisions to improve the life of the American society with the help of the government.
It might be called a revolution in the American political philosophy. For the first time in American history, the state was governing the American national economy in joint efforts of saving the country from the crisis abyss. Millions of unemployed people found a job for the first time in several years. They started to work for the government. The so-called public projects started to develop to an unprecedented scale all over the country. The government money was spent on building dams and train stations, airports and new stations, bridges and roads, public facilities and schools, hospitals and libraries, stadiums and kindergartens.
The system of public works created over a third of the available highways. The president didn't care for a balanced budget anymore. Inflation did not scare him. Unemployment was much worse than inflation. When a man, a father of a family, did not bring home a penny, such a country might face demoralization.
Due to decisive actions taken by the Roosevelt administration, the unemployment rate gradually dropped. The country began to get out of the breakdown dead end. There was hope. At the same time, Roosevelt started to fight with the overall corruption and mafia. The first shot in this was abolishing the Prohibition Law.
For many years, there had been politicians and activists in the United States who believed that if people quit drinking, all social problems would disappear. Due to the activity, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibited manufacture and sale of alcohol, was ratified in the United States after World War I. Certainly, the prohibition did not work. People still wanted to drink, and drank buying alcohol from mafioso structures. They began to drink even more than before. Forbidden fruit was sweet.
The war the government waged with the sale of alcohol could not prevent the mafia from making hundreds of millions of dollars from smuggling liquor from Canada and Mexico. When the Prohibition Law was abolished, the mafia was deprived of their main source of income. Excise duties began to flow to the state budget, and the life of Americans became easier and happier.
To talk with all by myself, no one to walk with, but I'm happy on the shelf. A misbehaving, saving my love for you, for you, for you, for you. I know for certain the one I love. I'm through with flirting, it's you that I'm thinking of. A misbehaving, saving my love for you.
A countrywide shoot-off of gangsters who almost openly governed the life of American cities began at the same time. But the war with the mafia was waged not only by methods of force. Roosevelt succeeded in carrying through the laws about criminal responsibility for extortion, racket for giving and taking bribes. Roosevelt could see the whole picture.
The main point was a criminogenic situation when adult men cannot earn money. Unemployment is the source of criminalization and demoralization. Roosevelt believed that it was better for a man to plant trees, produce things for everyday life, than let him go idle and demoralize himself, his children, his family, and so on. The system of support for the poor, all kinds of public works, were directly fighting crime.
The government passed decrees and laws to recover the industry and agriculture, to take emergency measures on railroads, in bank insurance, to help the young people, to guarantee the rights of employees and trade unions. Absolute majority of Americans supported their government, and that made Roosevelt feel confident about the chosen course. So he was determined to go on with the reforms.
Wealthy people.
It was that time when American tycoons were seriously concerned. They believed that first, the government poked the nose too deeply into their business, and secondly, the government now had real power. Some called Roosevelt a dictator. Others rebuked him for trying to turn America into a socialist country. In reality, all these allegations were groundless. All Roosevelt's actions were aimed to rehabilitate and save the dying capitalism.
The press, hostile to the president, wrote that Roosevelt was a man who destroyed the American way of life, that his invariable smile was a result of plastic surgery, that he was not Roosevelt, but a Jew named Reserved, who headed a Zionist and communist conspiracy against America, whose goal was to destroy the American economy.
Roosevelt took criticism very well.
Roosevelt was calm about those allegations. He expected that the upper class of the United States, the people among whom he grew up, would be against his reforms because they threatened their way of life. Roosevelt was confident about himself and his reforms, so he was not upset because of the criticism. He was one of the few American presidents who easily bore the burden of all of his responsibilities and hardships of the supreme power.
By the end of his first term in the White House, the reporters' attacks became even harsher. Though he could still deal with those attacks with humor, it took more and more of his energy. The larger part of American press belonged to Republicans, Roosevelt's political opponents. And in 1934, the largest newspaper magnate, William Rudolph Hearst, a former Roosevelt supporter, joined them. And now he was indignant. He believed that something terrible was going on in the country. The state is becoming the main power. Soon, the Hearst's newspaper empire headed the persecution of the president. Over the year before, the 1936 election campaign, the number of anti-Roosevelt publications had grown rapidly. The newspapers all over the country called on to vote for the Republican candidate, being silent or slandering Roosevelt's achievements. Chicago Tribune, for instance, would daily indicate on the first page how many days was left till the election, and, as they wrote, until the country is liberated from Roosevelt's dictatorship. Almost all American oligarchs ganged up on the president. They held numerous advertised meetings all over the country. They said something needed to be done because unprecedented things were going on and America was sliding down to socialism. Roosevelt wrote to Bullitt, the American ambassador in Moscow, "Big cannons now shoot." Financial and industrial kings of the United States, John Morgan, Pierre Dupont, Henry Ford, John Mullowan, and John Flynn, were against Roosevelt in a united enemy front. An example of his terrible actions was, as they believed, what was going on at Capitol Hill. Before Roosevelt came to power, the Congress was governed by several dozen of the richest Americans. Sponsored senators and congressmen were quick and obedient in passing right laws and amendments, in giving financial support to right companies and promoting right people to right positions. When Franklin Roosevelt came to power, the strong ties between the tycoons and legislators began to sever. The whole situation was incredible. The oligarchs declared war on Roosevelt and waged it in all possible ways. They barred him access to the money that was needed for a successful second election campaign. In 1932, 25% of the funds Roosevelt spent for the election came from bankers. This time, it was only 4%. For sure, the opponent party, Republicans, were rolling in the money provided by the tycoons and had no doubts they would win. It was a life and death struggle. Not only the second term of presidency was at stake, but the very future of America. But Roosevelt said to his team on the eve before the election, "We will win, and win easily." Roosevelt was sure he would win. He had the trump card underestimated by his opponents. American people were standing for him. And on November 3rd, 1936, he won, and his victory was the most lopsided in the history of the USA. During his second term, the war between the White House and the tycoons escalated even more. The super-rich Americans would still refuse to understand Roosevelt's strategy, creating a balance of interests which would secure the country against social disruption and breakdowns, which would ensure prosperity and growth of the U.S. power. Director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Foundation for United States Studies, Moscow State University.
Roosevelt used to say, "They accuse me of opposing tycoons, but I don't eat them for breakfast. My goal is not to impoverish the tycoons. There are nationwide goals that need efforts of the people, including those who got capital. Their role is not less. It's even bigger, because they have to bear certain social responsibility."
But why did American tycoons continue to be at war with their president? In the years that Roosevelt had power, the monopoly's income increased by almost 50%, and the stock value in the stock market grew 4 times. The answer was simple. Tycoons did not only need money, they needed power, and they almost lost it when Roosevelt was at power.
Made a gallant, sincere effort to raise wages, to reduce hours,
big businessman.
Capitalists, major businessmen, manufacturers still viewed the new course as a threat to their financial and personal power. He was called a dictator, communist, and fascist at the same time.
Его одновременно называли диктатором, коммунистом и фашистом. А народ Америки...
And the American people thought Roosevelt to be the savior of the American nation. Even though the new course could not completely overcome the Great Depression, America could still see changes and feel the real help from their government.
Реальную помощь от своего государства.
Besides his war with the Great Depression, tycoons, the press, and mafia, Roosevelt became more and more concerned about what was going on in Europe and Asia. Though many of his compatriots believed that America should not be concerned about what was going on beyond its borders.